So let me actually begin with the Minister for Economy and Finance of Panama, Mr. Alberto Vallarino Clement. Sir, will you please join me on the dais? Let me next invite Dr. Gita Gopinath, Professor of Economics at Harvard University. I will now request Mr. Amos Muhinga Kimunya, Minister of Transport of Kenya, to join us on the table. And may I now request Mr. Moreno, President of the Inter-American Development Bank in Washington, to join us, followed by Mr. Peter Van Loan, Minister of International Trade of Canada, and finally, our own Mr. Kamal Nath, Minister for Road Transport and Highways. Looking at the panel and the subject, Mr. Kamal Nath might just lapse into memory and forget that he is Minister for Transport and think he is Minister for Trade. But all of you, most of you at least, those of you who have been regulars at the India Economic Summit and at events of the CII and FICCI, would of course know Mr. Kamal Nath best as India's face in multilateral trade negotiations during a very critical time. Ladies and gentlemen, let me welcome each of you to this discussion. We have, I think, in front of us about an hour, a little over an hour. And the subject that we have been asked to discuss is whether emerging economies have become engines of global trade. An earlier note that was circulated to us, I'm sure all of you would have seen that, in fact, titled this session as a session on South-South trade, and to see whether there are new trends in world trade and whether these new trends and what these new trends mean for the economies concerned, but more importantly, what do they mean for each one of you in different sectors of business? Are we looking at changing patterns of trade, changing patterns of production which is linked to trade, changing flows of capital, and so on and so forth? Let me begin by posing a question which I would like each one of you to first talk about. The way I would like this discussion to go on is that I'll invite the panel to reflect on a couple of issues, but also then encourage each one of you to kind of interrupt, react to what others are saying, if you agree, disagree. I would rather that we have a discussion on the dais rather than individual statements. And then at some point we will invite questions from the audience. And when I invite questions from the audience, I would request you to stand up, mention your name and your affiliation, and ask a pointed question to one or more of the panelists on the dais. I think there is no question that we see important changes happening in the structure of global trade, the emergence of China, and the more recent emergence of India. Indeed, the earlier emergence of the Asian tigers has made Asia an extremely important magnet of trade, both in terms of exports and imports. Goods are coming into Asia from the rest of the world, and goods are going out of Asia to the rest of the world. What is, of course, equally exciting for those of us who live in Asia is that there is a surge in intra-regional trade, more and more trade between countries of the region. We in India, in fact, see a sharp increase in the last decade and a half in intra-regional trade. Our main trade partners barely a decade ago, during the Uruguay round negotiations, used to be Europe and the United States. But today, our main trade partners, in fact, are in Asia. And the importance of Europe has gone down, and so has the importance of the United States. What does all of this mean for those of you who are dealing on a day-to-day basis at the firm level in planning productions, planning trade, planning merchandising, making plans for investment, and so on? The second question I would like to pose to the panel is this phenomenon of growing intra-regional trade, that is, trade within Asia, trade within Europe, trade within the Americas, resulting in a growth of more regional trade agreements, free trade agreements, and contributing to the current impasse, as we have seen in the Doha round? Is multilateralism yielding to regionalism? And is that a cause for concern? The third question that I would hope members of the panel would look at is how much of this regional trade is in fact being driven by regional actors, and how much of it is being driven by relocation of firms from the north to Asia or to other parts of the world. In other words, is the rise of intra-regional trade within Asia because of the fact that Asian firms are more active, or because firms from the north, companies from the United States, from Europe, actually have relocated to China, to India, to other parts of Asia, and are become part of global supply chains, which would have implications for jobs, which would have implications for, of course, future growth of different economies. Let me begin with these three questions. What I will do is to first simply go down this way, and maybe as we go along, then I can pick and choose and invite different participants to say something more on what they've said, so that we can make this a little more lively discussion than a series of speeches. So, sir, let me begin with you.
Thank you very much. It's obvious that a lot of the South trade today is being driven by what is happening in Asia. The real growth has been here, but with that said, we cannot fail to see what is happening in Latin America, where also intra-regional trade has been growing a lot. And sometimes when we focus too much on intra-regional trade, we're not seeing that we also have transcontinental trade. In the case of Latin America, especially the southern countries in the Pacific, have increased significantly its trade with Asia, the same with countries like Brazil and Argentina. They're trading with Africa. So it's not only a regional matter. Obviously, it's being driven, obviously, by the growth of India and the growth of China, and in Latin America, the growth of Brazil. But it's something very evident that there is a pattern that is changing around the world, and that's maybe why our economies in the South are growing at a time when the economies of the North are going through so many troubles. Referring to the standstill in the Doha Accord, obviously, it has driven countries to go to bilateral treaties. It's eventually what we need for a real increase in global trade, and especially South, is a more level playing field. The individual bilateral trade accords and even the regional trade accords are an imperfect solution. I think it's a step towards eventually a conclusion of a level playing field for world trade. And for example, for countries like ours, like Panama, where we have a canal, that we would like to offer many more value-added services. Well, when we have problems with the denomination of origin, the only countries that could do that in our country to enhance their competitiveness by, say, assembling things in our country would have to be the countries that have kind of a mirror image of treaties that Panama have. So having a level playing field is eventually what we would like to have. The other thing is that when your question about whether is this just happening about multinationals relocating. I think we have very clear examples that there are new companies. It's not a matter of just incumbents that have been dominating trade in the world. Just gives you an example. For example, Brazil with Embraer. It's becoming a powerhouse in the airplane business, and we have examples here in Asia and in Latin America of our countries, in the South, having their own companies or even redeveloping and increasing the scope of companies. Just to finish, and plugging something for my country of Panama, we feel that we are going to be a catalyst in the South trading with the expansion of the Panama Canal, because when the expansion is finished in 2014, it will redefine the trade routes of the world. Right now, so much trade happens north, south, or intra-regional because the shipping routes, the competitive routes, have been designed that way. But by enabling, for example, post-Panama ships to offer round-the-world service that is not offered today, and allowing countries such as ours to become hubs, you're going to have many more south-south, very competitive routes. Today, those routes are competitive for bulk carriers. That's why there is so much trade between, for example, South America and Asia of minerals. But for the container cargo to really explode in the world, we need to have that round-the-world service and then feeder systems that would allow any country, not just the large players, to access other markets in a very competitive manner.
Thank you. Mr. Kimunya.
Well, thank you very much. Let me first of all explain something, because you might be wondering what the Minister of Transport is doing here talking about trade issues. But in my 8 years in cabinet now, I've gone through lands, finance, trade, and now transport, and they're all interlinked. So I'm very happy to participate and give you the different perspectives from all those angles. But looking at India and China and the other emerging countries, the story of their success, the success of India moving from trading to manufacturing, the story of China moving from trading again to manufacturing, being a global power, can best be told by the Indian and the Chinese people, because it's your success, and we're very happy and we celebrate with you. Seeing you coming from being traders to being big players on the global market, and it's causing ripples, and it's not for no reason at all, because you're displacing traditional trading partners, especially between Africa and the North, Africa and the West. And Africa is now trading more with the East, with India and China, forming some of those huge blocks from the traditional trade, and also from now getting into marketing, into manufacturing, and manufacturing goods that are affordable to the other developing countries. And it's the same thing going down to South America, to the Brazils, in terms of the Embraers and all that, and it's all affordable. So that story gets complex, and it's often confused. And all these issues about whether the South to South has a negative impact on the global trade within the wider multilateral trading system are perhaps borne out by that fear of where are we going into the future. And just first of all, to get rid of that bit about the impact that the growing influence of China, the growing influence of Brazil, Russia, and India has on the global system, I would only see it negative if there are some trade distortion features that affect the global trading system, which have actually not been proved. So for us, looking at it from an African perspective and sharing a common border with India, for example, I don't know how it's very clear to most people that Kenya, being on the east coast of Africa, and India share a common border. It's only that it's so wide and it's covered by water. The Indians possessed it first and called it the Indian Ocean. We would like to call it the Afro-Indian Ocean. But with our common border, there's been lots of common interests. Our trade issues go a long time back. And now the as India gets into the manufacturing, what's becoming very clear is India will follow the same trap that China has gotten into, that the wealth levels are going up, the lifestyles of the people are changing. They now start moving from traditional foods to more, what I would almost call the middle class food, and we now need Africa to feed most of India and China, and otherwise we will have a global food problem. But so that's all the opportunities I see them in terms of as India goes. We celebrate. We don't want to bring down those who are going up, but we see opportunities opening up on the wider global markets in terms of, yes, there's some traditional things done by India. It's moving up the chain. Now those are filled by the other developing countries who now will be supplying China and supplying India, and also in terms of the raw materials. But more importantly is that you can only do so much in China, you cannot do so much in India. You then need, for purposes of reducing the transportation costs and logistic costs, to move into the markets and start producing in Africa, in the other developing countries, in terms of, and using the manpower that's there, the economies of scale that can be tapped with the global operating from there by setting up the joint ventures, setting up the necessary manufacturing plants within those countries. So I see this as a big opportunity. The fact that, for emerging countries, economies have come up, they're shaking the rest of the world. But for us in the South, we see it as, it's one brother who's gone up. And you now know there's an opportunity of following suit. And we really celebrate the success of India and success of China, because it shows it can be done. And no new things have come except, just getting things right. And we in Kenya are following very closely, and very soon we'll be where India is, or higher up, because we'll follow your examples and avoid all your bad things.
Thank you. I'm going to actually come back to you on this whole business of, Africa's trade with China and India, whether it's only a geographical shift or there's a commodity shift as well happening, and we'll come back to that. But I'll now invite Dr. Gopinath.
Yeah, thank you. So I'd like to speak to the three issues that you raised. So the first was about what are the unique opportunities that are being afforded by the South-South trade. Like, what is special about South-South relative, say, North-South trade? The way I see things, the one unique opportunity that the South-South trade offers is that you can innovate in technologies that meet the needs of people in these parts of the world. So what exactly do I have in mind? I'm thinking here about the fact, like in India, you come up with, the Godrej came out with a refrigerator that's meant specifically to serve the rural poor. It's supposed to be highly energy efficient. It's portable. It works even when you have many hours of power outages. And so these are the kinds of products that are meant to meet the demands of low-income households in India. And that's a technology that is of value to other countries that also have a population where there are low-income households in those parts of the world. Countries that have similar infrastructural issues, as India does, with power and water shortages, those are the kinds of markets for which innovation in the South is a big plus. And that's not something that the North needs. I mean, the North doesn't really need a refrigerator that has to deal with power outages. And so these are the kinds of markets that the South has a comparative advantage because it's what the domestic economy needs, and it is what other Southern markets need. So in that sense, I think, that's really where I see the unique difference between South-South and North-South trade. Then, of course, there is this general question of diversifying your export base. You certainly don't want to be dependent on the North exclusively, and the most recent great trade recession, the great trade collapse is a great example of that, when your exports to developed markets basically collapse. The regions that are growing are the southern regions, so you really want to diversify, and you want to be in those markets, so you're not putting all your eggs in one basket, which is the North, and it's not very clear that these markets are going to grow very quickly in the near future. So these are my 2 points on the specific opportunities afforded by South-South trade. The other question, I'm going to reverse the order. So the third question that you asked was about, are we primarily seeing a relocation of production? Are we basically seeing that the North is relocating production to the South, and that's generating a lot of the South-South trade? Yes and no. So what we know factually for now is the big chunk of the rise in South-South trade is intra-Asia. That's where it is. There is trade that takes place between Asia and Latin America and Africa, but that's still a small part of the story. The overwhelming amount is intra-Asia trade. And certainly, one of the factors that's generated this big intra-Asia trade is vertical specialization. And it's not so much the northern companies coming in and deciding to relocate production in different parts of Asia, but it is the Chinese companies themselves deciding to relocate different parts of the production chain to different countries in Asia. So this growth in South-South trade is a reflection of this high level of specialization that's taking place in Asia and different markets, and the extent of vertical specialization that's taking place. The other big aspect of South-South trade is, of course, China's demand for natural resources. And so the flow of natural resources from Africa to China, and it's going to be true for India too. It's a growing economy. It needs a lot of natural resources. So this is the second channel that basically is a big driver of South-South trade. So the way I see it, we are kind of at the beginning of a big change in South-South trade, if I were to call it that way. And I would think that my first 2 points, which I raised earlier, which is about innovating, generating technologies that are specific for low-income households, and exporting those kinds of technologies, we don't really see that much of that happening at this point, but that's where growth would be great. The last point was about multilateralism versus regionalism. And certainly, I mean, the Doha round is unfortunately in a bit of a gridlock. There are no great ideas on the table about how to fix it. And so the hope is that by 2011 there would be some conclusion, and that seems pretty heroic. So regionalism, it seems to be the way, it has become practically the way to go, which to actually accomplish some amount of free trade agreements. Now, what are the costs associated with that? I mean, the standard argument has been that it's going to become much harder to bring about a multilateral trade agreement once you have regional agreements in place. And why is that? Well, it's because if I have 3 countries and we would all be better off, we had all free trade agreements with each other, but suppose that was not possible and 2 countries join up and decide to have a special agreement, then the bargaining power of these 2 countries is much higher relative to the third country that's been left out. And so with these growth of these regional agreements, you're creating regions of the world with stronger negotiation powers, and when they come to the table and they have to have a final discussion about multilateralism, it's a much harder bargain to push. But it seems practically that that's what's feasible at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Gopinath. Mr. Kamal, apart from addressing some of the issues I've mentioned, I was particularly interested in hearing your views on how you think this gridlock in the Doha round can be broken.
I'm the wrong man for that. No? I want to approach this differently. When we see this growth of South-South trade, now what has happened in the last 10 years? We have the numbers, so I won't go into the numbers. That's gone up by so much in capitalization, trade, exports. I won't go into that, but what has happened in the last 10 years, in the last decade, where global trade is concerned, where the global economic architecture is concerned? 2 very important things have happened, and that is globalization as never before, and number 2, technology. You find companies, whether they're in Africa or they're in Asia, who had no opportunities of trade because of internet, because of the internet, of FedEx, of DHL. You can be sitting at home, and as has been said, be a global company. You have access to the internet, you have FedEx, you become a global company. So globalization and technology has led to one very important thing, because at the heart of globalization lies global competitiveness. Now, South-South trade has just not happened. It's just not that India or China or Asia or Africa started doing things differently. Global competitiveness became the name of the game in globalization. And when you're finding South countries being more globally competitive, I think this architecture undergoes a big change, driven by that the mass of economic activity has been in the South countries, in Asia. When you see in Asia countries, forget India and China, you see other countries in Asia, even marching along at 3% growth. The economic activity they are generating, the hunger, the demand for raw material, for inputs, and then the value chain has been changing. Take a country which is doing extremely well, Bangladesh, on textile. It's the most amazing story. They're getting their fabric from one country, buttons from another country. The value chain is being developed in a manner where the end product goes to China, goes to Europe or the United States. But the buttons are coming from Malaysia, the fabric is coming from China, and so on and so forth. The yarn goes from India. India is a huge exporter of yarn. That goes to another country in Asia. It produces it into fabric. And then it goes to Bangladesh. So this value chain has also undergone a big change. 91% of the youth on this planet are in Asia, are in the South countries. That itself drives change. Now in India, when we talk of this huge demand, just to cite this, huge auto sector growth of 35% or whatever it is, why is that happening? It's the demographics, driven by increased economic activity in rural India. This increased economic activity in India or in Kenya, which was not there 10 years ago, which was not there 5 years ago, in rural, in the hinterland, that is changing. That is changing the architecture presently, and will drive and determine and shape the future of all trade. Why South-South trade? Lastly, you asked me a question about multilateral, and it was just said that Dr. Gopinath said that about FTAs. Now you must remember, regional trade agreements are WTO plus. Yeah. Okay, we keep forgetting this. And we think there are impediments. For many years I argued that regional trade agreements can be building blocks. Many of the South countries, Africa, in Asia, the biggest fear we had was the fear of the unknown. I was textile minister when we had the Uruguay round, the WTO was formed, and we had the multi-fiber agreement. I must be honest, I didn't know what I was doing. We didn't have NGOs, we didn't have the internet, we didn't have the calculations, but we said it's a great thing. We've had a great victory. God alone knows whether it will be a victory. 10 years later, when I was Commerce Minister, I said, remember, I said so in 95, it was a big victory, and it has been. That was the story. So, I believe that regional trade agreements, which are WTO plus, some of them are not comprehensive. Some of them are comprehensive. There's a big difference between saying a trade agreement, free trade agreement. Listen, no trade is free. This is a misnomer. The question is, what is the content of that agreement? If that agreement is on services, if that agreement is on greater national treatment or investment, these are economic partnership agreements which have a component of trade. And I think they, in the end, become building blocks. They become building blocks to a multilateral agreement. Multilateral agreement, I haven't changed my position. I'm fortunate I don't have that responsibility. But I always said that the WTO just doesn't stand for tariffs. the WTO stands for the rules of the game on global trade. That is not done by FTAs. So the rules of the game of global trade, the talks collapsed in 2008 July, and we had this great slowdown. What if there was no WTO? Can you imagine what would have happened? I think the world would not have yet recovered. It's because there was the great institution of the WTO, which were monitoring the rules of the game. But of course, moving further on various issues, there was no convergence. But that doesn't mean that the trading system had collapsed. So the WTO is the edifice of the global trading system. And I think as we move along, as we now talk of investment agreements, South-South, North-South, we talk of trading agreements, economic partnership agreements, that great fear of the unknown. Kenya had huge fears. You know, other African countries, I remember we had huge problems in the WTO on two things, bananas and coconuts. There was a huge issue. And we spent nights trying to, address bananas and coconuts. And they would ask, what do you do the whole night? We said, we talked about bananas and coconuts.
Cocoa.
And cocoa. And cocoa. Now, these look very trivial, but they impact the economies. They impact the lives of millions of people. So I think that the world is now alive and aware, and countries are adopting and adapting. And that is the great strength of the achievements of the last many years.
Thank you, sir. Mr. Van Loan, you are in fact the only unalloyed representative of the North on this panel. So I will expect you to speak more than for yourself in your present assignment.
Thank you. And part of my job as Canada's International Trade Minister is to travel the world, explaining that Canada is a land of boundless opportunity where anybody can achieve their wildest dreams, no matter how unlikely. And the fact that I, as Minister of Trade for the northernmost country in the world, is here on a South-South trade panel, I think is proof of that. And perhaps it's because we promised not to compete and undermine your banana and coconut trade. That could be the deal. But in fact, I do think Canada has something to teach by instruction. We are very much a trade-based economy. 2/3 of our economy is based on trade. And if I were to look at observations, we would believe that that is one of the reasons for our fundamental prosperity and our success, a success that a lot of people are not fully aware of right now. Canada right now is showing a tremendously strong economic success story. We have the strongest economic growth right now of any of the G7 economies, the major developed economies. We've got the lowest debt and deficit as a proportion of our economy of any of those countries again. We have the soundest banking system in the world. We have the most skilled workforce in the world, the highest proportion of post-secondary graduates in the OECD. And we believe a lot of those successful elements are based, in fact, on the fact that we've become a trading country and allowed that to bring in the disciplines of removal of barriers, because first and foremost, the real lesson and one of the great benefits of trade agreements are the removal of the institutional barriers and the ability of people like me who are politicians to get in the way of people like you who are trying to do business from being able to do what you do best. And trade agreements bring that discipline. And that has been certainly the case for Canada since our seminal agreement with the United States and then with Mexico. And when you look at our initiatives today that Canada is undertaking, we have 3 major new trade initiatives. One is with the European Union, one that is going very, very well. We're well advanced with it. The big attraction for us isn't just the European Union, it's the countries of Eastern Europe that were held back for half a century where we see real opportunity. But also, we would be, as Canada, the only developed country. It's the first time the European Union's ever tried to negotiate a trade agreement with a developed economy. We'd be the only developed country in the world with trade agreements with both the European Union and the United States, the 2 biggest economies in the world. So a tremendous destination and platform for investment, but we don't look at it exclusively that way. Our other 2 major initiatives are free trade talks with India, which we will be beginning tomorrow. Very important priority for Canada. And the third is our initiative to open up free trade agreements throughout the Americas.